All right, we are live. Hello, good evening. So, I don't know how many people are here. I reckon we can sit and chit chat for a couple of minutes while they filter in. But yeah, I mean, you guys have been very busy. How's things your end, Robert?
Well,
You're at the front end of starting this thing, so yeah.
well, it's quite something starting a new party. I mean, it doesn't come along too often, especially one that's got quite a different pitch to the other parties. Because a point I always make when I'm speaking to people about it, promoting it, trying to get signatures for its registration, is I say, look, we're not here to ask for political power so that you can give it to us, so that we can decide for you. We're actually, we've only got one issue. We're pushing for the referendum, and then that referendum actually allows us to take power away from the politicians and give it back to the people. So it's a fundamentally different message to pretty much every other party out there. And from my somewhat limited campaigning so far, I've done a bit in Rebecca Steele where I needed to go around speaking to people, collecting signatures. I mean, it's been an overwhelmingly positive response because people, they wanted a government. The majority of people in the Western Cape wanted a government, despite their flaws when it comes to administration, but they're still of the main parties the best player. But a growing number of people do want a referendum, and the Referendum Party gives them the best of both worlds.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, it really is a first in South Africa because I don't think any parties really campaigned on this kind of massive change before. I mean, I know people are going to go, "Oh, ANC," but really, I don't know. I feel like that's a default. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Well, no one's challenged the union like we have before. I think that's the important distinction. No one's actually said,
no,
let's
that's
not
true.
try and work within the system and reform the system from within. Let's actually fundamentally change the union, take away power from the centre and distribute it to the regions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly unique. We haven't got. We haven't gotten an opportunity to do this before in the country's history, and sure, but it'll be fun seeing how this plays out. Because I mean, yeah. By the way, just to introduce everyone, Yusuf is also a long-term, how would I call it, participant in the Cape Independence movement. He's been instrumental in building up the Cape Youth Front with Robert King, and it's going to be big business. And why don't you tell us about your perspectives joining and working in the movement so far, Yusuf?
Yeah, so actually, I've been involved with the CIAG and the wider Cape Independence scene for, I think, almost 3 years now, maybe just over 2 years. And I kind of had this feeling that eventually the CIAG would have to start a party. I think Donald Brown and I were one of the first people who were like, look, the DA. So for people who don't know, the DA basically, the CIAG has been trying to get the DA to hold the referendum on independence. But they say one thing, but then do another thing, So John Steenhuisen promised Phil that we would get the referendum, but then it didn't happen. And, they're vague about their promises. Another thing is, for example, the referendum legislation. Like in 2021, they said, we are for the right for people to have a referendum, but we don't, we're against independence, but we are for the right for people to have a referendum, right? And they said they would fix the referendum legislation. And what they did is in 2022, they put it on the agenda, the referendum legislation, but then they untabled it. So basically, how I understand is in Parliament, there's this tabling process where the bills have to first be announced or whatever, and then they finally go to be debated, etc., etc. But they basically removed it from the agenda. So it didn't even.
Yeah, no, it's the usual shenanigans. I mean, the DA are a very tightly run ship, and they don't like anyone outside of the Exco making a decision. And the Exco make their decisions according to how the donors tell them to behave. and the donors are basically all attached to Helen Ziller for the most part. I mean, there's a portion of them that come from Alan Winde and his crowd, which is why there's a lot of resentment towards him in the party. But it's basically just run by a very, very narrow group of people. And I mean, my impression from talking to people in the party is that there's not a lot of look, people who believe in the party line will tell you, we're a broad church and everyone believes this, that, and the other, blah blah, fish paste. But you speak to anyone who's even a little bit disgruntled with the direction of the party, and they'll tell you can't open your mouth even internally, even in reasonable discussions about big questions, without risking your career advancement. And they're not. It's that usual paradox that I find. People who are very liberal tend to have a very narrow perspective on things, and they're not. Because it's such a sentimental worldview, people's emotions are very invested in not touching any of the big questions. It's not very pragmatic. But yeah.
But I think the other issue, I think it's not a particular DA issue necessarily, but it is an issue that I think affects all political parties in South Africa, because our structures of political parties are quite centralized around the leadership, because it's party lists, so they allocate the list, they give you your positions. So if you look at countries like the United States or the UK or these other countries where it's more based on constituencies, and you've got features like primaries and things like that, and there's members selecting the candidates, then there's more power to the party members. But going back to the DA point, I think a point that needs to be emphasised is not only do they break their promises, but they continuously, were deceitful towards the CIG and how they approach things. Because throughout 2022, they were saying to the CIG, this referendum legislation is on track. Don't worry, in the next few months it will be tabled. Eventually it took, 22 months for them to table it. But during that time, they had actually canned the legislation and actually leaked documents showed that the reason why they canned the legislation was because they were worried of a Brexit scenario playing out in the Western Cape. So actually, they're worried.
Irony of ironies, hey?
But I mean, that just goes to show, they don't want to use referendums to actually empower the people. They just want to use referendums to basically give sign off on their agenda on what they want to see. So devolution, all those kinds of things. They want the referendum just.
Well, I don't think they believe in devolution either. From what I've gathered from looking, look, they've been in control of the province for 15, 16 years now, whatever it is, and they've done dick all in that whole time. When I was doing that guiding document for the Cape Devolution Working Group, I spent months on that thing. It's a fucking 100-page document, and combing through 8 different policy areas as well as looking at constitutional issues and things like this. Okay, it's a long list of extremely petty, niggling little loopholes that you can use to do certain things if you really have a lot of political will and you've got 10 years to do it and so on. But at the end of it, I kind of go, okay, but they've had actual serious opportunities to gain not insignificant powers over very important areas of governance, and they've been twiddling their thumbs for a decade and a half. The thing is, I'd always sort of had the perspective of okay, well, look, the DA they're good people, they're competent and what have you. They have some bad apples in some municipalities like mine, but generally speaking, their heart's in the right place and stuff. But after doing that document, before I'd even sort of encountered the kind of the way that they actually deal with political allies and promises by scrutinizing their behavior in coalitions up north, or the way they've dealt with the CIAG, or, just by looking at that document and seeing how seriously full of shit they are for making federalism one of their main national topics, and then just refusing to do anything concrete about it. And this is before the working group demonstrated that they're not really serious about it even now. The tiny little moves that they've been making are extremely unambitious. I mean, like they could have taken every single municipality where they have a governing majority and instituted municipal police in all of them, coordinated a central body, and basically de facto created a provincial police force. They haven't done that. They could have built really huge sort of power station projects, and the kind of stuff that, I mean, they have a lot of power over what's it called, education policy as well, and they've done squat with that. I just don't understand. I don't
There was
get
the
it.
People's Bill. There was the People's Bill as well that was presented to them. And actually,
exactly.
it was done through the Western Cape Devolution Working Group. When it was initially proposed, it was called the Western Cape Cultural Recognition Bill, and the DA asked for the name to be changed for it to be more palatable. Then there was a lot of different variations of the legislation where they sent it back and forth, and they wanted, for example, in one of the revisions, they wanted to remove the reference to the Khoi and the San people as the indigenous people of the Western Cape. So they wanted to erase their role they played in this province. And then after a while, they didn't actually want to present it themselves, but they said they would vote for it if the ACDP presented it, but the ACDP didn't want to present it, and they wouldn't vote for a Freedom Front presented bill. So they had a perfect opportunity to actually make up for the last 10 years of failures on devolution and actually put us on a pathway to federalism, and they just voted against it. I mean, well, it looks like they're going to vote against it at least. So it's absolutely, I mean, and the problem is Alan Winde as well, because Alan Winde, he doesn't have a single federalist bone in his body, as Martin van Staden pointed out. I mean, the guy seems that he's very, from the start, he's been opposed to any idea of a referendum on anything. So he doesn't even like the idea of referendums. He only wants it to be decided through the ballot box. He's misled Parliament on referendums, telling people that if you had a secession referendum, it would have to be a national referendum. You'd have to ask both sides. I mean, the guy just really, I mean, look, we cannot get federalism or power or anything for this province, any additional powers, with Alan Winde as Premier.
It's very frustrating. Go on, Yusuf, sorry.
Please. Like, speaking about the DA, I think they've done a really good job as administrators. And I see there was a comment here, wait, wasn't the RP specifically formed not to shut on the DA? Yes. Right. So, look, the DA has done a good job in being administrators, right? If South Africa worked on the national level, the DA would have been the perfect party, but they lack ambition, right? They lack the foresight to think, okay, what is the trajectory of South Africa and the Western Cape, right? And because of that, they aren't willing to take these bold steps. So these loopholes you talk about, actually pushing for federalism through international law via the Western Cape People's Bill, or, these are two bold steps for them because fundamentally they have this very bureaucratic nature to them, right? Which would have been fantastic if South Africa worked, right? Then it would just be okay, they do the job. The roads, the potholes are fixed, the electricity goes on, blah, right? But we do not live in that society. We have to take bold action, right? And I mean, I've been a DA voter, although, funny story, I did buy the Economist myth in 2019 about the Ramaphoria, but that's an aside. But other times I've always voted for DA nationally and provincially, right? And the thing is, the DA, they've done the job well, but now it's time to say, okay, look, we want to build on your work, actually. And that's what RP is, right? We are saying that's what Cape Independence is. We are saying, look, the Western Cape is different. She is run different. She governs herself different. There's also this thing of the chicken and the egg. Is the Western Cape successful because of the DA, or is the DA successful because of the Western Cape? There's also a little bit. Anyways. But anyways, let's give you more power. We actually just want to give the DA government more power. We want Alan Winde to be effectively the president of the Western Cape. Although I wouldn't want him personally.
But like, obviously, I'm going to differ because I'm with I'm a Vryheidsfront Plus guy, and I said, I mean, I think everyone in the movement sort of known that I'm a bit too conservative, to put it that way, to do the work of the RP, because it's going to be a relatively liberal vehicle in terms of its public messaging and so on. And I'm already, my flag's already planted where it's planted. I mean, I think for my part, looking at the DA, I think the reality is that a lot of the civil servants and functionaries that they have in their pocket, well, should I say in their deck of cards? Because if I say in their pocket, it implies something that I don't mean. But if no, but if they look, they have a lot of people who are very competent administrators, right? But a lot of those guys are like, they're not political actors. They're technocrats, right? And I think that the general supply of those kind of people will remain regardless of whether you have a liberal government or conservative government or a nationalist government, or whatever flavor of politics turns out to be the way that our new country works. I think that in general there are some sort of bigger, broader questions that the DA will struggle to answer in a satisfactory way. And I think the big one for me would be, I suspect that if they're not dealt with, if the DA's liberal tendencies are not dealt with, one of the first problems we're going to have is an open borders policy, because they're very, very pro, immigration, specifically from the black sector of the population. Which it's foolish if you look at the voting behavior of black South Africans. In almost any district, I think there's only in Gauteng once did they get more than 10% of the black vote, and I think that was in like 2016 or something. And everywhere else, it's always single digits in every election, and it's really sort of shockingly silly, especially when you look at how enthusiastic they are about township upgrading and stuff like that. One of the most shocking things that I found out, and I think I haven't posted about this yet actually, but there's let me see if I'll have to find it just now, but to show it. But I discovered that the DA on their own website boasted that they assisted a land invasion in, I think it was somewhere in the Free State. So I mean, it's on the level of like, they really sort of see themselves as like a more competent, slightly less Marxist version of the ANC. It's very, very bizarre, because there's so many different levels of things where they're just. It's not even naivete. It's like this weird sort of romantic sort of suicidal policies.
Yeah, anyway, I think there's a bit of a cultural thing here as well, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the leadership and the origin of the DA is like Anglo, right? It's very Anglo in origin if you look at the history, and I think unlike the Afrikaner or demographic in South Africa, Anglos have very much taken on this idea of like white guilt, and I think that has permeated into the DA's very psyche. So when it comes to like, they are always trying to almost like prove to everyone that, hey, look, we are not the Nats, right? But people still see them as the white oppressor just because of their skin color. A lot of people just see that, they say, oh, okay, John Steenhuisen and Helen Zille, they are whiteys, we must hate them, all right? There's a significant portion of the population who believes this, right? If you look at our the CIAG's polling, right, I think it was like only, what was it, Robert, like 30% of
31% of black respondents believe that South Africa believed equally to all races.
Yeah, exactly. And so this type of mentality exists, right? And I think the DA really believes in this rainbow nation and in this kumbaya vision where everyone
No, the
will
South
work together.
Africanism. Yeah.
Yeah, in South Africa, they really believe it. And they want to try and make it work out, and that's why you see them throwing the flags up for the Springboks and, being like, oh, yeah, rugby will heal the nation and everything, but it won't. I'm sorry, it won't.
Yeah.
Like we already won the World Cup and it didn't fix anything, right? So why would it work the next time around?
It's like you're
Yeah.
trying to install a liberal operating system on like a very conservative tribalist computer. I mean, that's the comparison that you've got. You've got this party, the DA, putting that that their worldview and ideas, which do appeal to minority groupings, and especially in the Western Cape, is very compatible. But when you look at the rest of South Africa, you're dealing with a fundamentally different civilization in many cases, and that's where the clash is coming in, and that's why the DA, I think last time in 2019, they got 16% of the vote in the rest of South Africa. So they're going nowhere. They've stagnated. But they can do a lot in the Western Cape. There is a lot of potential for them here as a political party. And the good thing is with independence, because you've got more competition will emerge with Cape independence, which means there will be more accountability. So they can't, just govern, as they wish. They will have to deal with other interest groups in the Western Cape and other, political parties that aren't Marxist, but they're, in the reasonable centre or on the right. And that will give us a far better system of governance because it will give us more accountability, it will give us more democracy. And I just do want to address some commenters from the comments that we've been shitting a lot on the DA. Look, if it seems like that, I think with me, I was just explaining the story of how we got here with the DA. And if it seems like I'm shitting on them, well, that's because that's what the story is. I mean, that's how they've engaged. I mean, they've misled Parliament. They've been very hypocritical when it comes to federalism. They've lied about referendums and what they were doing around a referendum. So, that's what we've been dealing with. And it's just come to the realization, we've all come to the realization, we didn't really want to set up a political party. But at the end of the day, when it comes to autonomy, when it comes to independence, when it comes to referendums, the DA needs to be held accountable. And the Referendum Party is the vehicle to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to push Phil to do this for like more than a year. But I think he was probably right to wait until now, to be honest. And I think I'm just generally a very impatient sort of guy, and I want to get ahead of the curve. But if you're too ahead of the curve, you don't get rolling. So
we had meetings in Rebecca. I remember discussing the party. I think at the beginning of last year.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, it's. I mean, speaking of which, it's been absolutely frustrating watching Jack Miller's party, the CIP, just not achieve it. And I mean, like, I actually had a conversation with him not long ago. I'm not going to cover everything that's just said because that would probably be unfair to him. But I did have a moment where I had to be a little bit blunt with him and say, like, nobody dislikes you as a person, Jack. Everyone thinks you're a great guy, but like, your party has not been performing, and we have the polling to show that there's plenty of, fertile ground to capture if you press the right buttons. I just, it hasn't been working, and for whatever reason, I'm not, and you can't get into sort of. I really hope, I really desperately hope that he has, that he finds it in his heart to sort of join the Referendum Party, because I think, I mean, he might, I wouldn't want him to get left behind. Him and his father have actually been pulling this wagon longer than anyone else. His late father, I should say, and it would be rather sad to see him left behind. But I think, the Referendum Party is clearly, a much more viable vehicle. There's everyone involved in it has demonstrated a capacity to organize, has demonstrated a capacity to change the media landscape and the discourse. There are contacts with people who can actually fund this vehicle. So I look at that and I sort of say, well, there's so many missed opportunities here, and it I don't know. It's just sad that it's taken this long. Ideally we would have been running a party like this with a serious chance of taking power. 5 years ago, 4 years ago, but here we are.
Yeah. I mean, I've been trying to engage the CIP, the Cape Independence Party, for I think almost over a year and a half now, because I realized that the Cape Independence Party has some issues, to put it. Like, they've done a great job in being the vanguard for the movement, but the landscape, the Cape Independence landscape, has evolved way beyond them, and they had to evolve. And I was trying to organize with a lot of their leadership and etc., and like collaborate from my side, and the links to I really wanted to like get the CIAG involved with the CIP, but there was just like this unwillingness, a bit of like static in the Independence Party, and it was really unfortunate, so I kind of gave up on that. And I think that's why the CIAG also, after a while, were like, yeah, unfortunately we will have to launch our own party, because the Cape Independence Party isn't what it is meant to be. I mean, a lot of these guys, they are like, fundamentally, if you look at it from a pure ideological viewpoint, they are like hardcore right libertarians, and I don't think the average Western Cape voter, wants anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, but right? I mean, aside from that, there's a sort of tone to the engagement that is, how should I say it? I mean, like, I'm like this. So I don't want to, put too much of an emphasis on this, but there's a sort of tone of bitterness in their public communications, which comes across, and I understand where it comes from. It's been very frustrating to drag that tiny wagon all the way from, what was it, 2007 or whenever they began. But Phil Craig, he's managed to strike a tone of optimism and collaboration and, positive energy from the get-go. And it's really that I think has dragged us forward, because, Des Palm and those guys, they were very, very good at their marketing strategy and getting a hold of a lot of actual support. I mean, 800,000 people is not nothing. But their ability to convert that into institutional power has been lacking. And I think that adding Phil Craig's sort of dynamism to that is how we're going to see real change, because you've got that. I mean, once they've got enough funds to actually directly email 800,000 people at a shot, then Capex it becomes a really, really powerful vehicle. And I think we can definitely take a good bite out of the DA next year.
There was saying on the BBC website that if you can mobilise 3.5% of the population, then it's like the organised minority thing, an organised minority can overcome it. If you can organise about 3.5% of the population and make them really active on something, then there hasn't been a social movement that has really failed with those kind of numbers. And 800,000 people, that's something like a quarter of the registered voters in the Western Cape. So just a small fraction of that were mobilised really into Cape independence. Then that's massive. That's a massive asset for the province and the entire movement.
Yeah, I just sort of I remember having arguments with Des Palmer about this, and sort of like, what are you doing? You're sitting on this stuff, and why? What, it's so useful. I mean, even if we did like as little as polling them and reporting on the numbers, that would have had. I mean, because they have the data, but and I think we've all seen it for how those people vote and so on. But it hasn't been made public, and they're keeping it firmly under their hats. I understand why, and Des Palm's a very, very principled man, and he thinks very carefully about breaches of privacy and all of this kind of stuff, which, going beyond things like letter of the law, Poppy Act, all of that kind of stuff, and just actually genuinely being concerned about breaching his promises to the people. But I think it's just, I'm very glad that he's now actually involved in a structure that can utilize what he's built instead of sitting on it quietly. What is that background, Robert? What's going on?
I've just had load shedding, so I'm just trying to find a more entertaining background.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, well, I can lend you some of my AI-generated propaganda. That big mantis with the glowing eyes.
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, with regards to Cape Exit, they've done a great job in getting 800,000 registered members, but their whole strategy didn't make sense at the get-go. Like, what are they going to do if they have 160,000 people who sign it? Are they just going to be like, okay, now what? It's like any sort of referendum or secessionist movement anywhere throughout history has always had like the regional government body being the force for that, So realistically, we need the Western Cape government to do all these things. And the goal of the CIAG was to effectively like transform, or maybe that's a bad word, to like influence the Western Cape government to take this stance, right? But it looks like we're going to have to launch the party because they're a bit stubborn. So I'm glad that the Cape Exit is working with us as well, because their database can come in useful for direct political campaigning, right? If otherwise, I wouldn't know what they would do with it. Like,
the other thing is, also they're cooperating more than they've used to, especially with a lot of the other groups, which I think is going to have real dividends for them and the Cape independence movement. Because if other groups can work with them and speak to their people, then it just allows, us to activate a far greater portion of the population. So I think what we've been seeing with Cape Exit in recent months has been very, very promising.
Yeah. No, I mean, my thing too. The only thing that I'm sort of thinking is, how much is the Patriotic Alliance going to grow next year? I mean, like, you do the maths and you look at the balance of votes from last time, and you think, okay, well, it's definitely the case that the Charterist parties, ANC, EFF, and then the Patriotic Alliance and Coloured Nationalism, they're almost completely impossible for them to get a governing majority. But there are two possibilities, and I mean there are two possibilities that I worry about, and one of them is a sort of long shot, which I doubt is going to happen, but it's not entirely unimaginable. And that is that the DA sort of actually let the ANC into government in the Western Cape, and the reason they would do this. And I would give this about a sort of 2 to 3% chance of happening. So not very likely, but it's just a horror story. It's just that, so many prominent members of the DA have touted the idea of a national coalition with the ANC. And for my part, I sort of think, well, the DA have basically no leverage. I mean, everyone's been talking to the Americans about the AGOA trade pact, but I think the ANC is willing to take the hit, and I think that if the DA want to get into bed with the ANC are going to make them pay for it. But that said, there's one other possibility, which is that they make up the gap that they need if they fall short of 50%. They make up that gap with a party like the PA or something like that. I doubt I think we'll be able to take enough from them that they can't resort to good or anything. So the option will be either with the Independence Coalition, which is Vryheidsfront and the Referendum Party, and then of course the other option being, well, the PA, which worrisome. I mean, I know that sort of historically their coalition strategies always excluded the PA since they got betrayed in Nelson Mandela Bay all those years ago. But I just, in the back of my mind, I can't really rule that out. I mean, I don't know what you guys are thinking.
I sense the PA would be a very unlikely coalition partner, just because I think they're going to ask for far more concessions than we are. I mean, at the end of the day, what the Referendum Party is asking is for the DA to implement a policy that they already promised in the past, that a majority of their own voters want. It's a very simple, it's a very simple concession, a referendum. So, what the Patriotic Alliance will probably ask for is a whole range of things, and they'll want access to a whole range of government departments with lots of tenders. So, I think when given the choice between the two, they'll go with the traditional partners, which include parties like the Freedom Front.
Yeah, I mean, because the Freedom Front has it's the most loyal coalition partner for the DA, and it's got a good record, a good track record of being very, how should I put it, mature and conservative, small c, in coalition strategies. They don't do any wild and outrageous things. They're always sort of very careful and reasonable. So yeah, I just sort of wonder because Helen Ziller told me once that her fear of Cape independence is, she says, it'll absolutely definitely result in civil war, and so it cannot be entertained under any conditions. And with a hardline position like that, look, I know people who are political like that will change positions at the drop of a hat, but it's worth considering how much clout she has and how hard she is against this. So,
but I mean, the alternative, according to John Steenhuisen, is the Doomsday Coalition, which he has said will lead to an ethnic and racial war. So they're saying on one hand, well, look, we can't do this because it might lead to it. But look, we've got this coalition that's going to possibly come to power next year. That will definitely lead to this, the collapse of South Africa, the collapse of the constitutional order, everything. So, I mean, the whole premise of their election campaign is that next year, we run the risk of eventually civil war with an ANC government. So, look, I think the most likely outcome by far is a coalition. If we get to the right numbers for the referendum parties, like the Freedom Front, is going to be a coalition with one of those two parties. I think that's the most likely outcome.
Yeah, and to add to that, right? So on the one hand, the Referendum Party is like the carrot, right? So all we're asking for is a democratic referendum for everyone all people in the Western Cape can vote on, right? Like, irrespective of their background. That's it. We don't want government positions or whatever. We don't want kickback. We don't want the mayor position of Beaufort West or whatever. We just want the referendum that they promised. And the other thing is, if the DA goes into coalition with the ANC, they will be punished for it. Like, that will be the end of the DA as the opposition party. They will commit seppuku effectively. Well, it won't be as
it's an absolute kamikaze move. I agree with you. I mean, when Helen Ziller did that BuzzNews conference in March last year, where she did a little triangle with DA and friends on one corner, EFF on the other corner, and ANC in the middle, and then she sort of says, well, the ANC will drop below 50% and start looking for coalition partners, and we must keep the EFF out at all costs. And I sort of looked at that and go, you've just laid out an argument with only one conclusion, which is coalition with the ANC. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, I know about the leaked audio now. So I think so I know that you're actually aiming for a coalition with the ANC and you don't have any leverage. And at that stage, I still felt like I was, relatively friendly with her. So I thought I'd write, and I knew she read my blog. So I wrote this long essay about like 7,000 words, where I just like really earnestly and on the level argued, I think this is a bad idea. Please, guys, think about it. And she just went off on me on Twitter, like went crazy. Of course, she said something very foolish in that diatribe where she said, we will not see. We are definitely not seeking a coalition with the ANC in its current form. Leaving open that wiggle room of, well, if it changes just a wee bitty, then they'll be okay.
And there was another tweet where she said that that she was still hoping. I think this was before the Parler report came out, or that entire scandal. She said, up until recently, I was still hoping that one day there were still good people in the ANC who we maybe could do a deal with. So up until very recently, at least, she's admitted that she still was quite keen to do a deal with the ANC. So it is quite concerning. But look, my anticipation would be that they'd probably be more likely to go into opposition than into coalition with the ANC. And I think Leon Schreiber has also recently tweeted that if the Doomsday Coalition comes to power, then we're going to need a very strong DA in opposition, even though that's going to be absolutely useless. But that seems to be the focus of the strategy now.
Like, what do they think they're going to do? I mean, like the response, I mean, it's like, okay, we're going into like Zimbabwe's like conditions, and we just think we need to be like the MDC, really fearless martyrs. And I'm like, well, what the hell are you smoking? No, if you have that happen to you, the only solution is violent rebellion, and there's no way the DA are capable of that. And I mean, it's nuts. It's absolutely bananas. The one saving grace of look, there's one thing a lot of people fear in the interior, and they think, okay, well, Cape Independence, Cape goes, big district for DA votes disappears, and we are left with a much smaller minority representation. We're going to be left on our own, expropriation without compensation, blah 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 blah. And I sort of think, well, yes, but all of the plans that you have for saving yourselves that actually are real, and those are the as yet unrealized plans that Solidarity and the Solidarity movement, that's AfriForum and SAI and Solidariteit and Sakeliga and all of these people, they want to put in this very comprehensive plan next year that hasn't really taken shape. I'm busy sort of speaking to them about being part of the research team, which should be fun. But one of the big things in there is that they actually need the Cape, because if the ANC start targeting capital, you need somewhere to be able to rest that capital where it's safe, and in the hands of people who have a kind of how should I put it, cultural loyalty to you that'll assist you. So not that that's going to, I mean, it doesn't make sense to leave yourself completely exposed. You need a little, what's that bloody castle in Lord of the Rings where they all the triple walls. They need a little castle to retreat to if they're under siege, and so the Cape's absolutely essential. And the interior policies of resettlement and concentration that the Anchortown plan requires will require a fair amount of capital. It will require industrial development eventually, and a lot of little things. And so the Cape is actually going to be essential to safeguarding those communities. And there's no other way around this. There's no other way around this. Cape Independence is necessary for the whole of Southern Africa to defend themselves from what's going to come from the ANC's government collapsing, because it will collapse. I mean, pretty much everybody who looks at the numbers for the fiscus for the next 10 years is like, oh, sherbet, the default is coming. I mean, even me with my extremely crude knowledge of statistics and finance have managed to put a few little dumb projections together. And it's not looking rosy, and there's no easy fix for this, because unless you get a government together that has the political will and the popularity to rush through a complete purge of the civil service, basically slicing their numbers down to a third, what do they think is going to happen? This is an unsustainable situation they're stuck in. I don't know how they're going to make. I don't know how even a DA-led coalition will run the party. And from my perspective, I look at the DA's experience with coalitions in metros. Every local election that follows them having getting into power in a coalition, they get less votes. And the simple reason for that is that the coalitions mean instability, because any of their small partners could cross the floor, and at the same time, you've got a civil service that are locked in, that are going to sabotage your every move, so people on the ground don't really see much of a change, right? And in the meantime, the Charterist parties are going to parade in the streets, and there's going to be a whole lot of intermittent violence, and looting will continue because of contacts in the civil service. So it's and that's playing for small, small beer at the municipal level. I mean, what do they think it's going to be like when they're playing at the national level and you've got the entire state security agency against you? Like, they're not realistic about the chances they have. They're not realistic about the challenges they're facing.
Yeah, and to add to that, so even if the country doesn't collapse, right, which it might, there's a high probability with that. And if there's a high probability for that, you want to insulate yourself against that. But even if it doesn't collapse, the second most likely, or maybe the most likely outcome, is this continued stagnation of the society, right? And if you look at like where South Africa is in terms of its international peers, we are heading to be in the bottom 25%, or we have already crossed into the bottom 25% of countries in terms of real income per capita, right? So life isn't getting better for anyone, and everyone deserves to live, like, to have a life where they know that next year, yes, it's going to get better. It's going to get better for my kids. It's going to get better for myself in 10 years' time. I know, like, I'm going to have more salary. I'm going to be safer. It's at a point you must just be like, okay, it's enough. So even if South Africa wasn't collapsing and it was just like this continued stagnation, I think Cape Independence has like a lot of basis to hold on there, right? So yeah. And in terms of the DA strategy, like, I agree. Like, look at what's happened in Johannesburg or in Pretoria. There's just been so much instability, and the problem is, it's again this thing of the ideological gulf, right? In the Western Cape, like, the thing is, the DA can work with the Freedom Front and these other more or less centrist parties, because they are more or less ideologically and maybe to an extent culturally aligned, right? But when you come and you try and build a coalition in a completely different context with people from completely different worldviews, yeah, it kind of just, it doesn't work, And you see this even in developed countries. For example, I've doing my master's in Belgium, and they're the Flemish and the French, they've got completely different ideological viewpoints of the world. And even though they're both from the same civilization, more or less, right? There was, for years, they didn't form a government on the federal level because they couldn't come to an agreement, right? And I think the gulf between the Cape, which has more or less like a liberal outlook, maybe growingly conservative, but in general it is liberal, right? That's why people vote for the DA, compared to this like Charterist or African nationalist, hardcore Marxist, but actually also Fanonian outlook on the world. and also from a different civilization completely. That difference between the rest of South Africa and the Cape is bigger than the difference between Flanders and Wallonia, right? So, like,
Yeah, it's
I
funny. I
don't.
remember you speaking on Belgium. I had a professor. There was a guest lecturer at UCT when I was over there, and he did a course on deeply divided societies. The sort of apex examples being Northern Ireland, South Africa, and Israel, Palestine. Right, those are your big sort of divided societies, right? And but he told me a story about his colleagues in Belgium, where he was working with a couple of Wallonian researchers who wanted to do a joint project with their Flemish counterparts, and sort of opened the discussion with, we'll include, that they'll include a little paragraph at the at the top, sort of apologizing for the way that the Flemish were mistreated in the past and all of that kind of stuff. And apparently the Flemish colleagues were not having it and didn't give a damn and say, too little, too late, sorry for you, bye, we do not work with Wallonians. And I was shocked. I thought, like, what is this? This is, this is modern Europe. Why do you guys care, But, yeah, compare that to South Africa, where, the way that we the way that we deal with things is sort of, well, do you believe that your race deserve to have all of their property confiscated, both movable and immovable, and be threatened with a complete removal of any kind of tangible powers and rights? If not, well, then we cannot really accept working with you. And it's like, that's the level the unspoken social contract is operating on at this point in time. And a lot of white people are actually willing to go along with it just to get through the day, it seems. And some have properly internalized it. It's absolute madness. But what can you do?
I think the important distinction as well between
jeepers.
Bel-
What happened there? You smoke a pack of cigarettes while we weren't looking.
Yes, because of the load shedding. When the difference between Belgium and South Africa is, like in Belgium, I think 60% of the population is Flemish and about 40% is Walloon or something like that. In South Africa, 88% are outside of the Western Cape, 12% are inside the Western Cape. So the simple reality is, any desires we have can simply be outvoted by the rest of South Africa. So there isn't really a need for some sort of collaboration or cooperation between the two sides. The one side can just dictate all its desires on the Cape. So that's the reality we have to deal with. It's actually far worse than what you see in Belgium.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's more about, like, what are the stakes? I mean, Belgium has this devolved government structure as a result that allows a lot of maneuver for the Flemish, German, and French parts of the country, and they operate often without a national level government in place. Whereas in South Africa, if you have a national level government shutdown, what the hell is going to go on? Because provincial level government exists entirely on grants distributed by the Treasury. So, like, the comparison is, it's the fact that they can survive the way they do is kind of largely due to the fact that they can cruise without having to agree on things, whereas we have to agree on things, or else it doesn't work at all. So, yeah, we are in big trouble if we can't get our act together. Oh, God, it's hot today. Robert, you've muted yourself.
Sorry, I see we've got a large number of questions. So should we maybe answer?
You want to tackle them? Let's do it. Okay, it's nice to see Cape Zuma in there again. I tried to invite him to the braai a couple of weeks ago, but exam times wasn't up for him. Anyway, let's see. Question, comments, jokes. Where the question is. The question
Good
must be
one.
asked: what even is South Africa? Well, I mean, that's what started my sort of that's what I started my sort of online presence with. Really, is responding to that question. I mean, like, there's no natural reason for South Africa to exist. It's an economic zone created by the British Empire for the purpose of more efficiently getting mineral deposits from the the Rand all the way down to the coast. That's all it's for. It's getting platinum group metals onto the ocean liners. That's it. There's no other reason for us to exist. There's no common culture. There's no common language. There's no common religion. There's no common racial background. Nothing. Even our legal system has had to be cobbled together from several different legal traditions, some of which conflict really, really egregiously. As anyone dealing with traditional law, traditional African law can tell you. There's no reason for us to exist beyond the gold, the platinum, and now for some reason helium. Really weird that they apparently found a big old helium deposit up there up north. Very important stuff, but yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on that because a lot of the conflicts in the world are because of these. What I've come to see is a lot of these conflicts in the world are directly a result of these artificial borders. And if you look at the regions that are most unstable in the world with the most artificial borders, with the thing is, like, there's this idea that we kind of have to believe that everyone is like the same, but that's not true. Like, we have different beliefs, different cultural backgrounds and practices and things, and people want to exercise their lives and how their government functions differently. There's this a bit of, it's almost like ironically, it's a colonial mindset that a lot of decolonial or like released states adopt, that, oh no, we can all just work together. But in fact, like the Igbo in Nigeria, they have a totally different type of lifestyle and cultural background than the Fano, right? And
Viva Biafra.
Nigeria is in a better position than us in the sense that they are a federation, at least, But I mean, for example, the conflict in the Middle East, or the conflicts in the Middle East, most of them come from either the suppression of self-determination, like of a group, or like in one form or another, right? For example, with I know it's a very sensitive topic, but like in Israel-Palestine now, it's got to do with the denial from the Israeli side to the Palestinians, but also conversely, like, Palestinians don't want to, especially like Hamas, they don't want to acknowledge the right for an Israeli state, right? But you have these two viewpoints. It's saying, okay, you can't exist, you can't make decisions, you can't live in the way you want to, and then there's no solution to that. The solution obviously is that both people or both groups understand, like, look, this is on the ground reality. Everyone has the right to determine their own futures in however they want, right? But
I mean, like, I differ from your perspective. Perhaps it's an intellectual level thing, but I really don't like this sort of artificial borders sort of argument. I mean, look, almost all borders have an artificial component to them. So, I mean, let's take Great Britain, right? I mean, it's really 4 nations, and for 800 years, it was the whole of Ireland, really. So 4 nations, and they were united by conquest and the subjugation of the various Celtic peoples to an Anglophone cultural and political and religious system. And the thing is that the British Empire functioned on a premise, as does every nation in Europe. boundaries in Europe never really corresponded to ethnicity until the world wars and their massive ethnic cleansing, which created these nice clean nation states we see now. And so, I mean, I think the reason that we're having trouble with them nowadays is that you've got a lot of sentimental ideas about what it really takes to create a stable nation state. That it doesn't. The idea that you can have one without this sort of crushing homogenization that comes as a result of state power, and the shape of institutional violence. And by institutional violence, I don't mean something sort of exotic and funny and intellectual. I just mean literally the way that law functions, which is men with guns come in your home if you violate a law, and they put you in a concrete box. And there are warnings and fines and things that happen along the way, but eventually that's what happens. So all states function according to a pattern of structural violence. And that is how they achieve the homogenization of the country. And this has happened to every empire and every community, political community since the dawn of time. And these grow because they have interests in an area and they need, for some reason, resources in that area, and so they take it, and people living there have to deal with the consequences. The problem with South Africa is that we lied to ourselves and said that there won't be any of this. There won't be any of this happening. We'll all get along fine and be on the same page, and everyone will be brought along without having to suffer for it. And it's simply not true. It's simply not true. And in future, the South Africa, if it's left to its own devices, will become a nation that seems organic, but it'll be based on the black race. And anyone who is not sufficiently black will and doesn't conform to the idea of blackness that is experienced among the elites in cosmopolitan regions will be gradually pushed out and changed and stamped with the whatever this Azania thing is. So that's the natural trajectory of South Africa. And look, if black South Africans want to be part of Azania and go towards that future, that's for them. Clap handies, happy for you. But I know that I can't integrate into that vision. And most people in South Africa who are minorities know that they can't, and that it would be unfavorable to them and their descendants to do so. So it's obvious that this is going to come to a head, and we have to, and better that we nip it in the bud now while it can still be done without a great deal of warfare and similar kinds of violence, because. Yeah, I'd rather that than have to pay for it in the expensive and rather more spectacular way.
Yeah, so you see how, to an extent, I agree with a lot of your sentiment. I just want to go back to something earlier you said about like the historical process. I know it's a bit of an intellectual.
Sure, no, this is great. Let's do it. It's my channel. I discuss this shit all the time.
Like before the during the medieval period and throughout the world, the age of empires, etc., these entities were very devolved, right? It wasn't the centralized, powerful state. So it didn't matter if the Persians ruled the Levant or if the Ottomans ruled the Levant or if the Egyptians ruled the Levant, because the people on the ground could live how they always lived, right? What happened is that there was the rise of the absolutism in, I think, about the 17th and 18th century, right? And the formation of really powerful state. The state became ever and ever more powerful, and its tentacles seeped into everyone's lives, right? Now, if you are not the majority or whoever the ethnicity of the absolute monarch or their culture, whatever, now you are being imposed their values because the state has so much more influence than it did 200 years ago, right? And I think that is why we see the rise of nationalism occurred then, right? So like we got this rise in absolutism, and then nationalism came after that, right? And then we saw the collapse of all these empires and the forming of nation states or states along the boundaries, because the state it evolved as a political thing, right? It became much more powerful. And the thing is, South Africa is run as a nation state, but it's not. It's an empire. We've got all these different groups and nations within it, right? But you know, like, and the Nats did it as well. They also ran it as an empire, and that's why there was problems. And this is the thing about self-determination, right? It's about allowing people to live their lives how they want to, and not be imposed by some artificial, or rather not be imposed by someone else's ideas. And you know, that's why for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Palestinians, they all lived together in peace in the Levant, because they could live how they wanted to, because the state was very weak, or you know, it was extremely devolved, right? But as soon as we got these nation states imposing ideas on entire regions that are somewhat diverse, problems, right? So in effect, Cape independence is a natural historical movement, because it's part of this greater trend throughout the world to fight against this like centralization that happened. So Cape independence, I see it as part of this movement that has happened since the 20th century. And we're seeing it more and more continuing, right? For example, in Corsica, the locals there, they've been part of France since, well, Corsica has been ruled by France for the last like 200 or 300 years, right? The people there are still calling for autonomy because they still have a somewhat unique culture and things, right? And now finally Macron is like, okay, we're going to speak about autonomy for Corsica and such, right? So we're seeing in the world like this idea of, okay, you know, you can't have these powerful nation states over these huge territories of so many different types of people as extremely centralized. Either you have to decentralize it, or you have to like allow for independence, right? Or secession.
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing is that from this perspective of, you know, those big states, there's a reason they do the kind of repression that they do to integrate people. There's a reason why, you know, the British forcibly stripped the Scots of their of public symbols of their culture. You know, there's reasons for these kinds of things. I mean, you talk about France now saying, yeah, well, it doesn't matter if we give Corsica independence. We're all part of the EU, aren't we? So there's a different sort of thing going on there. But I think generally speaking, that tendency that you speak of culturally different regions sort of pressing for their independence becomes more and more salient when you're dealing with a democracy. If you're dealing with sort of a kind of autocratic government, you know, whether it's a kind of monarchy or an old-fashioned aristocracy or something, then you've got sort of local power brokering, and you're much more flexible in how you can structure your government, because you don't have to worry about popular legitimacy in quite the same way. But specifically now with democracy, you have to find some kind of integrationist perspective, or else people are going to constantly be worried about people who are different from them and how they impact power in the society. And there's that whole sort of leveling and equalizing element to democracy, which makes people much more powerfully resent those who are more well off and more powerful than they are in society. So I think particularly now when we're dealing with a world where it's still very, very difficult to get away with a structure of government that's something other than liberal democracy. I think it's very, very dangerous to find yourself as an unprotected and unorganized minority ethnicity in any state, because it'll always be in the interest of the majority to suppress you or oppress you. If it's not happening now, it's it's like, you know, a gun lying on the table, or let's put it differently. It's $100 bill lying on the floor for any beleaguered national government that they can just sort of pick up and say, well, oh yeah, these people are creating the problems for you, and we really need to take care of them because they're big danger. And I mean, you see this increasingly in South Africa as people are talking in a much more serious way about the problem of white people, or the problem of foreigners, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that's always going to be a problem unless not unless, it's always going to be a threat unless you're capable of organizing self-defense. And you don't have to necessarily arm yourself to the teeth, although that certainly helps. In our case, it's, you know, we all band together and say, well, you know, we can have a territory where we are, if not the majority, at least a big enough plurality that we can't be pushed around. And, you know, then things become a much more sort of equitable process of negotiation for power and negotiation for rights. Because if your rights aren't backed up with the capacity to fight for them, they're not real. They're just a notion. Yeah, I mean, speaking to that sort of majoritarian impulse, we have someone offering a very sort of common left-wing critique of our position, which is someone saying natives ethnically cleansed beyond the frontiers and blocked from their traditional pastoral grounds over centuries are the ones who will decide, and demographics are in their favor in the Cape already. Well, look, let's be fair. There's a lot of black immigration from the rest of the country, and we don't have a lot of time to get Cape independence done. But as for the sort of arguments about you know, ethnic cleansing and all of that kind of stuff, I mean, the amount of black people who've been removed from the Cape is not enough to really make that kind of argument. And if you want to talk about traditional, you know, people who traditionally live in the Cape, there's I mean, I faced this argument with someone who claimed that, you know, Bantu culture was spread all the way to the peninsula based on a third-hand account that was fairly garbled, that a translator gave to Jan van Riebeck, that he wrote down in his diaries. But you follow this kind of stuff up, and it turns out that, you know, examining primary sources, if you want, you'll find that you know, Bantu-speaking peoples for the first, you know, 50 odd years of European settlement didn't venture further west than the Sundays River. So
I heard, you know, I don't think I reject the whole, like, who is here first, like, whole debate in the first place, because it's very similar to what's happening in Israel Palestine, right? You can go back hundreds and hundreds of years, look at this document, look at that document, whatever. Okay, what is the on the ground reality right now? Right, the on the ground reality right now is that the Cape is different to the rest of South Africa. Okay,
fair enough.
And for example, in you know, the on the ground reality in the Levant is that there is a lot of Jewish people there, right?
You can't remove them.
You can't remove them, and same with, you can't be like, okay, they don't have they must just go and then everything will be fine. Okay, but that's the same with Israel, because like on the Israeli side, because they also like, this whole area belongs to us from history, right? But they are on the ground Palestinians there, right? So it's the thing about like acknowledging that this is the on the ground reality. Okay, history is history. Let's like accommodate each other. And if you don't, I mean, that is why Cape independence is happening, right? Because the on the ground reality of the Cape being different to the rest of South Africa hasn't been acknowledged. It's been not accommodated for, and that is why Cape independence is a movement. And that's why I think we're going to win, because our critiquer here, he's like, oh no, we have a right to displace the on the ground reality because of some documents,
imagined past. An imagined past. So
Yeah,
I mean,
even if it was true, right? That doesn't give you the right to displace human beings who live here for multiple generations. Like, I'm also from not purely native, right? My family came from Gujarat, 4 generations or 5 generations ago, as right. That's my roots. But like, this is my home. I've only known the Cape. I mean, I've studied abroad, but I grew up in school here. I made all my friends are here. My friends and family are here. This is my home. You can't just be like, oh yeah, but in the 17th century, this goat herder wrote a document, and therefore my people were here, and that means you have no right to live here anymore, right? That's absurd.
it's silly nonsense. I mean, like,
absurd.
I agree 100%. I mean, it's like, can they point to actual plots of land? Can they litigate this specifically? Who else are potential claimants? That kind of thing. So you're going to lay claim to a land. Can you identify the person who's actually responsible for your displacement? And are there any other potential beneficiaries who are descended from the original people who are removed? Are you willing to dispute a certain tract of land and have it divided between 26 or 50,000 other people? If not, maybe you should take a chill pill and move on. Because what they're really talking about is, these broad amorphous categories, and they're just which don't correspond to legal realities. And then they try and fudge the law by saying, "Oh well, they're pastoral," which means that it has to be collectively dealt with. I'm sorry. I mean, come on, get off it. But moving on from this, before we get bogged down in litigating colonialism, there's another question, which is the only thing I worry about after Cape independence is massive increase in land invasions, gang violence in the Cape, and people's war tactics. Now, this is actually an interesting critique, and the guy who says Cape Zuma, I know him. I had a few chats with him. Very bright guy. I mean, I have thought about this a bit, but I'd like to ask, what do you guys think? What's your take on it, Robert King? You've been quiet for a while.
Yeah, look, my general sentiment is that we actually run those risks being a part of South Africa, because we've already seen it to an extent. Oh, the power's back. We've already seen it to an extent, under the ANC. Obviously you've seen the ANC's allegiances and alliances with the Cape gangs. So we've already seen this, but the big distinction is we've had these tactics used on us, but we haven't had control over our border policy. We haven't had control over our security policy. So I think this is going to be an inevitable thing we do have to deal with, but at least with independence, we actually have a degree of control over how to respond. So that's my general sentiment when it comes to this issue being raised.
Yeah, I mean, Yusuf, have you given this sort of criticism much thought?
Well, yeah, look, the status quo is what's happening. That's the status quo. I mean, I agree with Robert. Like, it's the same thing with the borders argument. People be like, yeah, people flood across the border and there'll be mass. But that's the status quo, right? Like, there is no border. There is no
right.
There is no border.
So I mean, like, at least with independence, we have the power to actually do something about it. I mean, I think one of the big things about this is that, additionally, everyone in independent Cape qualifies for South African citizenship, so or has it rather. And so one of the tools that you have that most states won't have is that anyone who commits a crime, you can fucking deport them. So if South Africa doesn't want to play ball on issues and they try and undermine us, well, then you just take everyone who's a troublemaker and you ship them on the other to the other side of the Three Sisters border crossing. So it seems a very trivial issue to me, and a very quick way. I mean, one of the big issues that you have with people like what's his name, Bukele, is that he can't. If he's dealing with all the gangs, he has to go build enormous prisons. But we only have to do that if we come to a nice, equitable agreement with the former South Africa on how to handle international affairs between the two of us. if they prove to be recalcitrant and hostile and actively undermine us, well, then we simply round up every violent criminal in the country and dump them in South Africa. That's as far as I'm concerned, that's an extremely delightful solution. Any sort of seditious terrorist violence, any kind of organized crime, sorry, I think you'll enjoy South Africa much more. You know.
I think there's an interesting question here from Ben's basement on the,
go on.
The referendum being called too early. And I hear you, but I think, like, considering the polling that the CIG did, right, we see that the majority support independence, right? So if we were, look, and this is before we've had like mass campaigning and serious money, which we are starting to get now with the Referendum Party. People are like, okay, this is serious, right? So this is before like serious money has, and we've been able to compete on the level, for example, like that the DA can. People already feel that this is something logical, and this is like, necessary, right? So I don't think we would lose the referendum at all. I'm very confident we'd win. And I think
I agree.
I think calling it now is probably better than calling it too late, because, right, if we call it in 7 or 8 years' time, right, then just purely going off IMF data, we're going to be one of the poorest countries on the planet, like in the bottom 25% of countries, right? And that's excluding a fiscal default that is purely just on like this constant 1% to 0% growth, right? So if we default, then it's going to be much worse, right? So Cape Independence it's actually, in my opinion, like, that's perfect timing. We have to have it right now. Otherwise, there's going to be big problems.
Yeah, strike while the iron is hot, because we have the support, and look, polls have a margin of error, but it's fairly decent. We should be able to win by a margin that's not Brexit style split down the middle stuff. And as long as we don't absolutely screw up in the next several months, we should be fine. The real question is getting institutional coordination, because one of the big questions we're going to be facing is how to actually logistically deliver a referendum if it's opposed by the national government. Because Catalonia has dealt with this problem before, and then you have an issue of low turnout because of police interference, public opposition, violence, and so on. So even if you get that sort of high rate of return, you're going to have a low turnout, and then you're going to have to make sure that whoever's in charge of the province at the time sticks the landing and doesn't pull a Piedmont and say, well, thanks for participating in the referendum. Now I'm going to go ask permission from the Spanish Crown and see what they think. Dumb stuff like that guarantees mass street violence. There are very obvious problems to avoid that we're going to have to take very seriously moving into it. And I think, it's a once in a lifetime shot, and if it fails forever, and we move on to more creative and more sort of unpleasant maneuvers. But I think, this I think is obviously the best time. You're never going to get another chance where politics is so undecided, and people are desperate enough for solutions. And I don't think, and I think, the country will be so concretely doomed within 5 to 10 years that there really won't be any other sort of political level option left. So it is what it is. Unless Robert King has something to add or criticize there.
No, I just think when it comes to the referendum point, I think that there's a number of factors, especially when you have radical movements for change. A lot of the times, people's hearts will want the change, but their heads will say something else because of uncertainty and everything like that. Especially when it comes to economic security and their living standards. But it's almost the inverse with Cape independence, because when you look at the polling that was done by the CIG, 63% of people thought their lives would be better off in an independent Cape, including 40% of Black respondents. So, I mean, this is quite broad support, and I think that fact is key, because when people are undecided, they're going to look at what's going to make them better off, and Cape independence seems like the default option for that. So I think that plays into our favour. And then the other thing to remember is, for a lot of people, they don't need to be convinced that Cape independence is a good idea. It's a natural conclusion. Anyone can really come to it. The thing that they always need to be convinced of is a referendum possible? Is independence possible? So I think once you get to, and I think you can't really look at the end stage and try and convince people of the end stage. You first need to go through each stage in that process. So with the Referendum Party, we're just talking about a referendum. So it's very simple, actually, getting from where we are now to the referendum. I mean, the referendum, you need the Premier to call it. If we can force a coalition, we can force the Premier, we can get that referendum. So it's a very easy way to see how we'd get that. And then I think once you've got people to the referendum stage, then they can already see, the independent stage, the final, stage of the process. So I think you have to take people gradually along that process. But as they are taken along that process, I think they get more and more convinced about the end outcome.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things where the biggest obstacle in the past has not been convincing people that it's a good idea. It's always been convincing people that it's possible. So it's an issue of demoralization, and a lot of people are. I mean, that's why it's so important to have competent leadership, because if the people representing you are not doing a great job, everyone loses the will to live. And you can see how many people are trying to leave this country, how many people are trying to flee. It's
all groups.
Across all groups, but I mean, I think it's particularly tangible amongst minorities, where nobody aspires to being a member of the government. No one aspires to being in politics. No one aspires to being a member of the police or anything like this. There's nothing to reach for. And even if you look at the corporate hierarchy now, it's like, you expect to have to, take a lot of, you expect to eat a lot of shit, basically, to survive in the corporate environment. So it's like, it's a pain. But I mean, I suspect one of the big things for Cape independence that once it's achieved, that will stand in its favor, is that you'll start seeing a kind of reversal of the demographic issues, because you just securing the borders sort of is not actually that much of a difficult security challenge. There's only a few crossing points, and they can just be dealt with fairly simply. In terms of dealing with immigration policy, you can hand preferential working visas to anyone who's racially discriminated against in South Africa. You can hand preferential visas to any returning any returning expats who are overwhelmingly ethnic minority. At least the balance is strongly leans in their favor. Increasingly, it's containing the black middle class too, but they're still underrepresented in expat communities. So you're going to be dealing with a fairly significant change in the flow of things.
Yeah, look, and I mean, I think if people want to come to the Cape, they can, but they must ascribe to its values, right? And that's the problem we have currently, is that people come to the Cape from the Eastern Cape, they don't vote DA, and they don't believe in the DA's values, and they don't believe in market economies, and
they don't believe that non-blacks deserve to live here. I mean, they come to a place where their ancestors have never been. and they say, well, actually, all these people around me don't deserve to be here. Only I do. And it's a bizarre kind of arrogance.
Yeah, it is. It is. So, look, I'm
like our
open
ancestors,
for
I guess.
people to come. Yeah, I'm open for people to come as long as, like, they ascribe to these same values. But anyways, like, that's policy, and it's almost like 9 o'clock, so I think we should round off. And someone said we need a message of hope, and I agree. And, like, for me, Cape Independence is hope. It is the only hope. It is such an amazing thing. Like, all of us, like me, Robert ×2, Phil, everyone, we all just ordinary people from the Western Cape, and maybe the broader Cape. Some people from the north, right? But we all just, like, independently found this thing, and we've built this movement together. And everyone who's online following, you're also part of this movement, right? And we can do it together. Like, history has, like, changed so much. The borders of the world have changed. Like, in the last 100 years, I think 120 countries have come to existence. Why not the Cape? Let's make this happen, and we can make it a beautiful place for everyone, with good law. Oh, sorry. Yeah. They interrupted me there, but yeah, it'll be great. Let's do this, guys, and like, we will work together with everyone who wants to make this great, like the FF Plus, RP, some people in the DA, some people from the Colored Nationalists.
I would just have one thing. I think we're all gonna we know who's gonna work on our side. We know who's on side with us, and I think we've got a great team. We've got the Vryheidsfront Plus for conservatives, which will and for Afrikaners, it'll take a decent little slice. RP is gonna capture a lot of the sort of moderate ground of DA supporters. But one thing that I would like to say that I desperately hope I could impress on any sort of future minority immigrants coming from the rest of the country is, please do not make like most Joburgers do, where they move into a heritage Cape houses and then strip everything out and turn it into some, god-awful exposed brick and steel and a monstrosity. Please do not do that. Have some decorum. That would be my number one prayer for the future would be, do not destroy our lovely little houses.
Use the AI's inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I mean, I've seen too much of it in my town already. But I'm a sentimental old fart, so there you go. Anyway, on that note, I think we can round out. But thanks you guys for turning up, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. And good night, and God bless, and vote right, please. All right, cheerio.
And spread the